My son used to laugh when I cried. I remember that moment vividly, the way his lip curled, the flicker of contempt in his eyes, and the silence that followed. No apology, no shame, just that cold, amused smirk, like my pain was inconvenient noise. I sat on the edge of my bed, shaking, barely able to hold the phone bill that had doubled overnight. He stood across the room, arms crossed, acting like my distress was a performance he'd already grown bored of. He didn't always treat me like that. Once he clung to me with sleepy hands and whispered promises. But the boy I raised, the one who used to reach for me in the dark, vanished long before I realized he was never coming back. Now, he flinches when he sees my name, not in his inbox or a birthday card, but on the lease to the building he thought he owned. He doesn't laugh anymore. Not when he has to send his rent check to me. Not when the woman he discarded holds the deed to his pride. If you've ever poured your soul into someone, only to watch them treat your love like leverage, then this story is yours. If you've ever been dismissed, used, or silenced by the very person you sacrificed everything for, I want you to stay with me. What happened to me didn't unravel overnight. It came in small moments, quiet betrayals, and 1,000 overlooked warnings. But what they forget is, the quiet ones remember. Hit that like button if you've ever been underestimated. Subscribe if you believe revenge doesn't always scream. Sometimes it signs a contract. And comment below, because your story, like mine, deserves to be heard. My name is Claire Matthews. I'm 55 years old. I spent most of my life working in public education, not because it paid well, but because it mattered. I liked seeing potential in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. Maybe that's why I kept believing in Ethan, long after I should have stopped. Ethan is my only son. His father, Mark, passed away when Ethan was just 3. A drunk driver. One of those stories people shake their heads at, then move on. But I didn't move on. I folded all the broken pieces into motherhood. Ethan became my whole purpose. Every meal, every scraped knee, every midnight worry. It was all for him. He was a bright child, always reading ahead, always asking questions that surprised adults. I remember thinking, he's going to change the world. And maybe he did, just not in the way I imagined. In college, Ethan began studying real estate law. He said he wanted to build something that lasted. I beamed with pride every time he talked about equity, zoning, leverage. He spoke with conviction like he could outsmart the system. I never imagined he'd start using that same intellect to outmaneuver me. The distance started slow. Fewer visits, shorter calls, birthdays replaced with Cash App notifications. He said he was busy building. "It's all for the future, Mom," he'd say. Our future? I believed him. When he needed help with tuition, I dipped into my retirement. When he said he had a chance to invest in his first property, a duplex in a transitioning neighborhood, I co-signed the loan. He looked me in the eye and promised, "You'll never regret this." I wanted to believe that, so I did, again and again. There were red flags, subtle but sharp. Documents arrived at my house addressed to Ethan, but tied to my name. When I asked him, he smiled and brushed it off. "Just paperwork, you don't have to worry about it." His tone wasn't kind, it was rehearsed. One evening, I invited him over for dinner. I had made his favorite, roasted chicken with garlic potatoes. It was a quiet evening until I brought up a notice I'd received from the bank about an account I didn't recognize. I asked him gently if he knew anything about it. He laughed. Actually laughed. Not loud, but with that slight head shake people use when they think you're being ridiculous. "Mom, you always overthink things. You're too emotional." Too emotional. That phrase lingered like smoke. I had raised him, held him through night terrors, stayed up grading papers just to afford his field trips. and now I was too emotional. But I didn't say anything. I nodded and cleared the plates. I still thought this was a rough patch, that maybe he was just stressed, overworked, trying to impress people I didn't know. I told myself, he's still my boy, he just needs time. Then came the bigger signs. He asked to use my credit score to help secure funding for a second investment. Only temporary, he assured me. It'll help with the rates. You're not on the hook for anything. He sent me a document to e-sign, calling it standard paperwork. I skimmed it. I shouldn't have. Over the next few months, my mailbox became a stranger. Letters I didn't understand, charges I never made. I confronted him again, this time more firmly. Ethan, I don't recognize these accounts. They're in my name. He barely looked up from his phone. It's taken care of. That's when I started losing sleep. I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about every moment I had sacrificed to keep his world intact, and how easily he let mine unravel. My hands trembled every time I opened a letter. I stopped checking my bank app. I couldn't bear to see what he'd done with my trust. I kept telling myself he would come clean, that he'd admit he got in too deep, that he'd apologize. But he never did. He stopped returning my calls. He was too busy touring his new units. Units bought with my name, my credit, my silence. And the silence? That was the heaviest part, because I wasn't just losing money. I was losing my son. It didn't happen all at once. Ethan didn't turn into someone cruel overnight. That would have been easier, I think, to draw a line between then and now. But what really happens when someone betrays you slowly is that you lose yourself in the gray. You doubt your instincts. You cling to old memories instead of facing what's in front of you. After that dinner, he stopped visiting entirely. Weeks passed without a word. When I finally reached him, his tone was clipped, like my call had interrupted something more important. He told me he was working on a new development project, said it was too complex for me to understand, but that everything was under control. That phrase again, like a cold slap. Then came the first real blow, a formal notice from the bank. The refinancing paperwork had gone through, on my home. The house I had lived in for over 30 years. Ethan had used it as collateral for a commercial loan. I stood in the kitchen, holding the letter, my eyes scanning over language I didn't fully grasp, until I saw the part that said I could lose everything. I called him in a panic, no answer. I tried again. He texted back 3 words. It's handled. Relax. I sat down on the tile floor, the same one where I used to sit cross-legged while Ethan colored beside me. I stared at the cabinets, the fridge, the window over the sink, all the things I had built my life around. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. A week later, I showed up at one of his properties. I hadn't told him I was coming. It was a townhouse he had renovated with investors. When I arrived, he was in the driveway with 2 men in suits, laughing, gesturing at the architecture like he was born to it. When he saw me, his expression flickered. Not guilt, annoyance. I asked to speak to him privately. He sighed, stepped away, and let me talk. I told him about the refinancing, about the bank letters, about the fear. And I'll never forget his face when I said, "You used me, Ethan." He looked directly at me, no blinking, no apology. I didn't use you, I leveraged you. I didn't speak, couldn't. I felt the air leave my lungs. He saw my expression, and for a split second, his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "You always said you'd do anything for me," he said. Well, you did. That night, I stayed up until dawn. I walked through every room in my house, touched the door frames, the curtains, the chipped paint I never got around to fixing. I looked at the framed photos still on the hallway shelf. Ethan in kindergarten, Ethan at graduation, Ethan holding the keys to his first car. All of it, funded by me. I kept waiting for the tears to come, but they didn't. My chest felt hollow. Not broken, just emptied. Then came the humiliation. At a neighborhood barbecue, I overheard Ethan talking to a group of young professionals. I had arrived late, bringing a tray of deviled eggs like always. He didn't notice me at first. Boomers don't understand modern finance, he said, chuckling. They think owning a house means control. Meanwhile, we use equity like currency. The others laughed. He didn't realize I was standing just behind him. When he finally turned and saw me, his face didn't flinch. He just said, "Didn't know you were coming," and walked away. People looked at me differently after that, like I was the fool who couldn't manage her own affairs, the poor woman who'd raised a wolf in sheep's clothing. But the final moment, the one that shattered whatever illusion I had left, came in the form of a notice taped to my front door. Eviction. Apparently, the loan Ethan had taken out against my house had defaulted. He had missed 3 payments. The bank wasn't interested in family drama. They wanted their money or their property. I stood there, hand frozen on the doorframe, reading the notice over and over. My legs buckled. I slid to the floor and stayed there for what felt like hours. I cried then, not loud, not wild, just a steady stream like a faucet I couldn't shut off. And in that moment, my back against the door of the home I had built with my bare hands, my face wet with quiet grief, I remembered the way Ethan had laughed. Not once, more than once. He had laughed when I cried. That memory became something else. It stopped being pain. It became fuel. Because the next time he'd see my name, he wouldn't be laughing. After the eviction notice, something in me changed. It wasn't dramatic, no screaming, no shattered glass or storming into his office. Just a cold, final silence, the kind that comes when grieving turns into clarity. I didn't call Ethan again, didn't text. I didn't tell him what I was planning. I made a pot of coffee, sat at my kitchen table and started reading. Loan documents, title transfers, property agreements, the same papers I used to skim over with trust. Now I studied them like a second language. I found every instance of my name, every signature, every inconsistency, every clause that shouldn't have been there. And I started keeping files, manila folders, labeled by hand. The woman he'd called too emotional was now running her own quiet investigation. It took me 3 weeks to find the right attorney. His name was George Halston, real estate fraud specialist. Sharp, but not arrogant. He listened carefully, didn't speak over me, didn't patronize. When I showed him the forged signatures and overlapping loans, he didn't hesitate. "This isn't just unethical," he said. "It's criminal." We filed the paperwork in stages, careful not to tip our hand too early. I gave George power of attorney over several matters, shielding my name from future retaliation. At his advice, I stopped responding to anything from the bank and redirected all communication through his office. It gave me space to breathe and space to move. Through a third-party broker, I started tracing Ethan's assets. His LLCs were layered, shell companies built to hide ownership. But he'd made a mistake. He'd filed one of the initial business licenses using my address. That gave me standing. I used a dormant trust from my late husband's estate, something Ethan never knew existed, to buy into one of Ethan's joint ventures anonymously. Just enough to give me access. Just enough to make noise. Every time I found a new leverage point, I documented it. I wasn't reckless. I was precise. I learned the system he had weaponized, and I turned it against him one step at a time. At night, I wrote everything in a journal. Not out of sentimentality, but discipline. I wasn't a mother chasing closure. I was a creditor chasing restitution. The shift was subtle, but absolute. I no longer saw Ethan as my son. I saw him as a man who had stolen from me, deceived me, humiliated me, and assumed I wouldn't understand enough to stop him. But I understood now, and he had no idea who was coming. The first blow came quietly. Ethan's firm had scheduled a board vote to greenlight his next big development, a multi-unit complex in a newly rezoned district. What he didn't know was that Through my silent stake in the LLC, I now held just enough voting power to block it. The day of the vote, he walked into that room expecting applause. Instead, he walked out with a deadlocked motion and a pile of questions from his investors. He called the managing partner in disbelief. "Who the hell blocked it?" he barked. But my name never came up. Not yet. The second blow was legal. George filed a formal complaint with the state licensing board, citing forged signatures, misused personal credit, and unlawful refinancing of a primary residence. Attached was a thick stack of evidence, time-stamped, notarized, authenticated. Ethan wouldn't see it until the board reviewed it. We wanted the impact to land clean. While he scrambled to manage the fallout, I took the next step. One of Ethan's recently acquired buildings had gone into foreclosure. His financing had slipped, and the bank was preparing to auction it off. Using another front entity under my trust, I bought it. Clean, legal, undisputed. That building included 5 tenants and a 6th luxury unit on the top floor. His. The lease was in his company's name, but the title was now mine. He wouldn't know until the paperwork processed. And when it did, I had a new lease drawn up and sent to his address. I made sure the envelope was clean, white, professional. Inside, just a single page, his name, my signature, my terms. That night he called. I didn't answer. He texted once. "Is this a joke?" I didn't reply. The next morning, George received a furious email from Ethan's counsel demanding clarification. George, always precise, responded with one sentence. "Please refer to the enclosed deed transfer and lease documentation now in full effect." Within days, Ethan's reputation began to erode. His investors, once dazzled by his confidence, pulled out. His social circle tightened. Calls stopped being returned. And all the while, I didn't gloat. I watched. I documented. I protected what was mine. The final blow came quietly, like the others. At a city council hearing, his name was flagged in an open ethics report. He wasn't charged, but the questions lingered. Deals fell through. Licensing stalled. He moved out of the penthouse unit 2 weeks later. The neighbors said he left in the middle of the night. No boxes, just a suitcase. That's when I changed the lock, not out of pettiness, out of principle. Ethan never publicly apologized. I didn't expect him to. But when the consequences finally caught up with him, his silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. The luxury buildings he once bragged about owning? Gone. One by one, they slipped through his fingers, foreclosed, reclaimed, or sold under duress. The city he'd claimed as his empire now barely recognized his name. He was no longer a player. He was a warning. He sent a message through George, a short, pleading email. No threats, no denial, just a single request. "Can we talk?" I didn't reply. There was nothing left to explain. The satisfaction didn't come from watching him fall, not entirely. It came from the stillness I felt inside. For the first time in years, I could open my bank account without fear. I could walk into my home without scanning the mailbox for bad news. I stood in my kitchen one morning, tea steeping beside me, and looked out the window. The garden was overgrown, but peaceful. My name was clean. My future was mine again. And Ethan? He learned that the woman he had used, silenced, and underestimated was not weak. She was simply quiet, until she no longer needed to be. Looking back, I don't see revenge. I see correction. I see the slow, deliberate act of reclaiming what was taken. Not just money or property, but identity, dignity, boundaries. Ethan didn't just forge documents. He forged a version of me that was helpless, emotional, naive. And I let him for too long, because love can blur the sharp edges of betrayal, but love without respect becomes debt. And I was tired of paying interest on someone else's entitlement. I've learned that power isn't always about volume. Sometimes it's quiet, steady, the strength to walk away from someone you created when they no longer recognize you as human. He used to laugh when I cried. Now he cries when he sees my name on a lease he doesn't control. That's not vengeance. That's justice with a mother's touch. If you've ever given everything to someone who thought they were entitled to more, if you've ever been told you were too soft, too emotional, too easy to use, then this space is for you. Hit that like button if you believe that silence isn't weakness, it's preparation. Subscribe for more cinematic revenge stories where justice isn't explosive, it's exact. And share your story in the comments. Tell me, have you ever had to teach someone that love is not a license to take? That your kindness wasn't a mistake? Because sometimes the quietest people leave the deepest echo when they finally speak.